atrocities that happened in Tahrir Square, of rape of women and, really harassing women over there. So these are part of, the practices that happen. But at the same time, I think women have to be present and have to show their presence, field over there, like we did in Iran, of course in the wrong way. But we did it, we were there, we were there in millions. I can say now that it was wrong of us to be there, but at least we were there, and we can criticize ourselves now. So the presence and the understanding of our role is vital.
Thank you. Any other?
Just before, actually, I'm thinking approaches is very, important thing is approaches. If you go into education, you can see samples of Saudi Arabia's women, they are educated. But if you talk to them, sometimes they do not believe that they can get equality. And my experience in 1 million signature, they used to talk to women, some of those just very clearly, they didn't believe that they could be equal because they actually they had kind of defined for their own roles in the society, defining that way because I used to go kind of like villages. They used to explain that what was the role of men, what's the role of women. So I don't think that some of them, they were like educated from universities, and in my opinion, it's very important that we take into account that legal issues is the most important in terms of clearing the rules. And there are different between rules and provisions. If you go into the society, still law is there, still rules are important because people following the rules. And if you write the rules in paper and enforce, the enforceability of the rules are important. So how you, this is a device, I think. The main point is, if you believe some kind of change making difference against violation, write in the paper and try to enforce it is our goal, enforcing. So how you can do that? If, as my colleague said, if you wait that society conclude all the opinions and get to conclusion and bring to the paper writing there, or you just try to get your goal in like short time period. So the thing is, yeah, we need to change that society rules, but we need device, we need something to do that. So I think it's very important.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think culture and education are quite a long-term solution to the problem, and we should definitely work on them. But I think my experience of living in this country and working in public sector and private sector is that I came across people who were sexist, who were racist, but I think because there is a law here, they were not allowed to exercise those deep feelings of theirs. And I think in generation we can see in this country now that the schools are more mixed compared to American schools where the communities are very, very divided. You can see that, for example, they promote mixed housing. They can easily exclude social housing to somewhere outside London, but they are not allowed to do that, even though some of the policymakers would like to do it. So I think law is quite important, and I think, as was mentioned by someone, those who are politically active, and NGOs and all others, it's good to have some sort of international law which all countries have to abide, and that goes back to the basic rights of people, and that should be followed by all countries. I I don't know how that can happen. Also, the other point about culture and education, I think they only work where there is some degree of democracy in a country, where countries are so limited, and it's very difficult to kind of change the deep root cultures without having access to generic media, basically. Yeah.
Thank you. We have about 12 minutes. Is there any comment from the panel to what's been said? Yes, no?
I feel a bit guilty. I feel like because I'm a professor of international law, I'm the skeptic, but I want to explain where my skepticism comes from, and without in any way undermining the importance of laws. We have international laws which have been fought for very hard. I mean, it was really the excesses of the Second World War and the Holocaust and totalitarianism which finally made the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then people have struggled to implement those laws, and we go forward, we go backward. Harvard psychologist Carol Gilligan, who's one of the pioneers of sort of feminist epistemology, explains in her view how in her sort of psychological experiments, women tend to think more contextually, men tend to think more in universalizing abstractions. And I think we need to learn to think contextually. So when Dina is talking about the law in Egypt, right? It's very different than thinking about the law in Iran and the law in Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, making equality subject to Sharia is going backwards, just as the laws in the Iranian constitution take us backwards. Before 1967, they took us back 200 years, whereas maybe in Saudi Arabia, the situation is very different. So we just have to understand the dynamics between legal formalism and culture, and there's a very complex interrelation. So it is true that when the law prohibits something, including, for example, the death penalty, it's a black and white question. Female genital mutilation is not, because people will still do it in the private sphere until the law becomes internalized in culture. So we don't need to say, is this more important than that? They're all related, and it depends on the context to determine how they're related. But I want to say that the whole issue of tradition and modernity also, we need to be a bit more discriminating, because yes, would I say modern laws are better for women than traditional laws? Probably yes. Until I went to a hospital when my grandmother was very ill in the final years of her life, to see in Canada all these elderly women that are completely abandoned, who show no respect by their children, by their grandchildren, and that maybe gave me a different idea about, well, is there something about tradition and belonging and community which is also very humanizing. When I look at human trafficking is the modern slave trade, and the victims of human trafficking are in the tens of millions. And it's not happening in traditional society, it's happening right here in the UK. You want to know about prostitution rings here, abducting women from Albania and Moldova, and taking women from Nepal to India and the brothels of Bombay in a thoroughly modernizing context. So what is that about? Well, it's outwardly modern, but inwardly consumerist culture which institutionalizes sexual violence while at the same time masking it in the discourse of progress. So we need to be just much more critical in how we approach this, and not simply parrot the kind of modernist, legalist discourse, and understand it in a very different sort of context. And I think once again that we need to be self-conscious also. We are elites. All of us sitting in this room here are part of a very, very small elite, which is not a bad thing, because we also have a responsibility and opportunity. And sometimes I've learned that, I don't know, a soap opera may be a better way of educating the public than, you know, a PhD dissertation. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't do the PhD dissertation, but we should be able to think strategically about how does everything fit together. How do we impact that grandmother or mother or patriarchal man in a very sophisticated way to get them to move in the right direction. And that's the challenge before us.
In support of Sarah, I just want to say, as I said earlier, which was the law or changing the culture in society. I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, the African Parliament was debating the age for juvenile crime. There's a massive difference between the age for boys and girls. Boys who were seen under the age of 17 were seen as juvenile, while for girls the age was 13. Now the Afghan parliament, especially the activists, fought for increasing the age, and they agreed on 15. Still there is not the same age. And I just give an example of a girl, again in a traditional society like Afghanistan, who was accused, she's a juvenile, she's 15, she was accused of having a relationship with the neighbor's boy, and she went to prison, in a juvenile prison. Now, she was given a lenient sentence of 3 months. She was released, and this is, we have a law, she was released by the court, yet her mother and her brother killed her. And it was, and I think when we say education, as we said earlier about the female genital mutilations, which is mostly done through, women asking for it. I think what is important is changing the culture, educating those women, and maybe if that woman who asked for genital mutilation, if she had education, if she was exposed to education, and she had the knowledge, then she will not be asking for this to happen to her daughter or granddaughter. I still see it. I mean, we are lucky to have some of the very progressive rules written in Afghan constitution, even still under the banner of Sharia law. Afghanistan is an Islamic country. But I think until you educate women, until you educate men, maybe more than women, we will have these problems.
But you have very educated, the thing is, you have very educated women who take their daughters to perform FGM. You have very educated men who hit their wives.
Okay.
Or kill or kill their daughters.
Modern.
Very progressive, modern,
It's the cultural change
educated.
that is needed.
So, this is where I contest education, and it comes back to belonging. But then, what is the price of belonging? And I don't know. I know that a lot of research actually in Egypt. There was a very interesting book. So research in Egypt also says that it's a very women-to-women domain, FGM. We have 70% FGM in Egypt, but at the same time, I know that the mothers do this to their daughters out of fear of their daughters being ostracized. And the belonging is in a country based on social solidarity, and especially in poor areas. And then here we get to class. We didn't discuss class at all, but there's this whole other range of ideas around class. When you have social solidarity, when you're very poor, if you get ostracized, you lose also your economic interests, and you're abandoned. So there are reasons, there are logically, rationally, love-related reasons why mothers perform this to their daughters. But then the price of belonging, I mean, we know certain things. It's not like we don't know that this is wrong. We know that this is wrong. So I don't have like easy answers, but at the same time, I think having the laws there and enforcing them, like you mentioned law enforcement, are two fights, and I don't think that they are contradictory. You can have NGOs and activists fighting to have the law, to have something written, and at the same time fighting to change the culture, or fighting to ensure that the laws are being enforced, that I don't go to a police officer and tell him that I was harassed and then he harasses me. And this is another fight. And I think it's really interesting what you said about they are racist but they cannot exercise their racism. And in deeply racist societies, like I believe Egypt is a very racist society, I need laws that ensure that this person, I don't care what he has, that his feelings, his bottled up feelings, he cannot act on them. And also, like the point which you mentioned, we ignored Sharia law, but what Najiba just said about there are laws that are discriminatory. What about this? We're just talking as if laws are necessarily enabling, but there are other laws that we need to fight. That's another, the third, another fight. To fight to change them because they are discriminatory and because they're there.
I have to say, so just one point, I have to say that in the line of my work, I'm constantly up against representatives from the Islamic Republic. And the arguments that we have with them constantly is they use the culture and tradition argument against everything that we say. And no matter how much we scream and pull our hair out, that the world has progressed, we have international standards, you are subject to certain international standards, even within your own national laws, you have amended certain things, but still we are up against culture and tradition as an excuse for violation of rights. And I get very concerned and very scared when I have to start pandering to tradition and culture so that I'm within the context of that society to bring about an improvement or progress for women. That's a very scary place for me to be. It's a very fine line of how you do this tradition, culture, and progress, but because I'm up against it constantly, it's a very, very frustrating place to be. So for me, I'm with Gina that I think we need to have something on paper that you can then hit them on the head with, no matter how unenforced it is. The fact that they are signatory to certain conventions allows me to bring them to accountability. Now, what they do with that accountability, whether they choose to respond or not, is something else. But there are times, because they are accountable, that they then choose to go and change. So the fact that it's there, that the convention is there, and they've had time to bring national laws in line with their international obligations, actually gives me as a human rights activist and a defender a tool. So that is a tool in my hand. And it's very difficult because then it allows me to protect the grassroots activists on the ground, because that's what we can do from here, is to try and create a safe environment, because I think we all agree that you need education and you need to culture change before you can effectively bring about change. But you can't do it if they're being persecuted. So it's a very difficult place to be.
Yeah.
So.
Well, one of the problems, for example, we have in Iraqi Kurdistan, we have Iraqi constitution and Kurdish constitution. In the Iraqi constitution, because in 2003, US and UK got together, they put mullahs and women fundamentalists all together in the constitution writing committee, and they were saying, hey, we included women representatives, so there will be rights for women. They come up with this very funny constitution. Every article is against the one before.
Yeah.
For example, it says women and men are equal before the law, and the other one says we do not ratify any international declarations that is against Islamic Sharia law. The other say that we guarantee equality for women, and then after that it says Islamic Sharia law is the main and only sources for legislation. It's just really a big joke. What we have in Kurdistan, of course, there has to be a written constitution as well. We made a really huge campaign. We said, we are against Sharia law, even mentioning it in the constitution. There was a huge fight, and I was involved in the campaign. But what they did after all this campaigning in Baghdad, and of course in Kurdistan, all progressives and secularists, they come up with this. Sharia law is one of the sources of legislation making, and then they ratify the international declaration. However, up to this moment, there's a big fight over it. But in Kurdistan, we have a more kind of open-handed situation whereby people say that we are not an Islamic state. Kurdish people are not Muslims originally. Islam was imposed on us by force of sword and so on and so forth. It comes a little bit from the nationalism.
We say that in Iran.
Exactly. So those who are not really Arab speaking, in that sense, they have this, when we fight, there is this justification that we don't want Islamization, we don't want Islamic Sharia law. But of course, the women's movement have been really fighting a lot. Last year, they passed domestic violence bill law, and the right of child, like if your parents beat you up, there is a certain number, like here, very much taken from the European laws. And then, but up to now, the government did not implement it. And now there are demonstrations going on calling on the government to actually implement those laws, to actually protect women. When they report to the police, they should not be sent home, they will be killed. Because it takes a lot for a Kurdish woman or for a Middle Eastern woman to go to the police station in those patriarchal societies to say, well, my brother beat me up, my husband beat me up. And if the police doesn't really act and not to involve, and if they don't involve the relevant organizations, then they send the woman home. There were a couple of cases lately, and then there was really huge demonstrations against the government. Why your police are so patriarchal and so backward and so anti-women. They send a woman home, she was killed, for example. Then after that, like 2 years ago as well, we had, we have these directorates of combating violence against women. Before that, no woman will go to the police. All these years, no woman will go to the police to say that I am about to be killed or my husband is killing me, But after we had all these campaigns, they opened these directorates against violence against women. Now more women go and report the violence. And they produce surveys, researches, and numbers and data so that you can tell. Now we have documented incidents of violence against women, be it beaten, be it verbal, be it physical. So actually, why I say it's important for us as grassroots to push for it and to insist on them to be implemented. That's where my earlier point was coming from, really. The government is not ready to implement laws. They are not ready to actually take into account what we are fighting for, but we fight for it, we push them, they make a legislation, even according to our terms, but then sometimes they don't implement it, they don't even care about it, they don't set up the relevant institutions to deal with it. But now we have, actually we made, in some ways, to give credit to this government that most of us are up against, they do, because we made a really huge uprising last year against them, so they are now more trying to make reforms and listen to women's issues and so on and so forth. So that's why I'm saying every little gain is important, but to insist on it and to move on further. And the only thing in our countries is the Islamic Sharia law. It's really a killer to everything, to every effort, because no matter what you come up with, they say, oh, it's against Sharia law, or it's not compatible with it. So that's really, really difficult. But as I said, in the Kurdish constitution, we have this whole thing. The domestic violence law, the mullahs from mosques, they started saying, oh, this is against our tradition, this is against Islamic culture, this is against Sharia, Astaghfirullah, Kurdistan is becoming Europe and Israel, So they were making a huge fuss about it, and we have it on the YouTube, and we kept on laughing at these mullahs, what's going on? But, this is the problem. We have also mosques that are brainwashing the men. Thousands of men go there, and one of the mullahs was saying, what kind of men are you? If your child go and reports you, what kind of father are you? You have to beat the child up, you have to beat your wife up. So you have these types of mullahs in all those countries, you have these types of mosques that are actually centers for promoting men to have this masculine Islamic personality and to control women and children. So these are the problems, I think. That's why education itself, I don't know, is good. We are all educated. We want everybody to be educated. We do not want illiterate people. But the problem is sometimes even those educated people, they are in the government and they are worse than somebody who have a grocery shop. That's, they could be more progressive and more into equality with men and women. But actually we have all these men in with PhDs and masters, but they cannot come up with something progressive. That's why I think it's important to mobilize and to push them back.
Right, thank you. Yes, go ahead. I'm just going to ask everyone for a last comment because we have to wrap up.
No, I'm just once again on my feelings of guilt as Professor of International Law. I will once again just share a short story. I'm a member of the Baha'i minority in Iran. So that has very much shaped my experience with the United Nations. And in the 1980s, in the first decade of the revolution, when tens of thousands of people were executed, that included also many members of the Baha'i community, including my family. And in those days, the United Nations was the only way to address this issue, given the context in Iran. So your point is exactly right, that the argument would be that it is prohibited to basically execute people because of the religious belief, and we don't care about your interpretation of Sharia law. That is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says. And there is something wonderful, especially as a lawyer, about the clarity that that is the law. But ultimately, to me, the most important thing was in 2009, when 3 million people poured out into the streets of Tehran. And when people were chanting on the streets, we support the rights of Baha'is, that to me was much more important than any resolution of the United Nations. When Mr. Mousavi, who himself was Prime Minister in the 1980s when the mass executions were taking place, also comes up and says the Baha'is have rights too. Why does he say that? Because he has to, because the new generation demanded of him, a civil society that is forcing him to say that. So maybe it's that experience that makes me understand that culture is so important, that the declarations of the United Nations General Assembly are still important. They put pressure on Iran diplomatically. But the regime is much more afraid of the people out in the streets than it is of some Western governments denouncing it in the United Nations in New York. So that is maybe the point that I'm trying to
But it's not
emphasize.
balance of creating a protected space for them to then speak to Iran, because that international forum gives us accountability, forces us that when they are present in an international situation where they're being forced to answer for what they're doing, for example, to the Baha'is, then those kids in Iran can come to the street and say it. And the wonderful thing about the Baha'is was the fact that Ayatollah Montazeri spoke up.
That was my point as well, that one of the most remarkable things was when Ayatollah Montazeri in 2010 issued a fatwa saying that although the Baha'is are not a heavenly religion, they still have human rights.
Yeah.
I will take that. I don't care
I
if
think
they're
that's
heavenly
the
religion
biggest
or not.
achievement.
And that's
for me,
the point, that it
yeah.
came from a grand Ayatollah Montazeri, did not come from the secular activists. And I think that's why I was trying to say the Iranian experience is very useful, because Iran is in a post-ideological transition, because people have been disabused of these totalitarian myths and romantic utopias, whereas elsewhere there is still that attraction of, I don't know, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin or whatever kind of, and people will in due course realize that, well, it's not the romantic idea that we've had. But we have to accept that historical process has to take place. There will be casualties, sadly.
Yeah.
It's a sad reality. There will be casualties. You just have to make sure it doesn't go to the point where it's going to take you decades and decades to try to reverse the damage. And just finally, I'm really glad that you talked about education and belonging. These are, as you would put it, contested concepts, and we have to think, what do we mean by education? What do we mean by belonging? And one of the exciting things that is happening now in the Iranian community is the new Iranian nationalism defined on human rights, not defined on militancy or belligerence, but saying that if you're a true patriot, if you're a true nationalist, you will stand up for the rights of your fellow citizens. That's what it means to be a patriot. That's what it means to be a nationalist. Not to have, I don't know, a nuclear program or whatever idea, masculine concepts one has of a strong nation, but a nation which is actuated by justice. So in a sense, we need to strategically appropriate these discourses and reshape them in our imagination. And that sometimes is more effective than sort of the path of direct confrontation. But there will come a time when you can't. You just can't. You cannot maybe reconcile Sharia. Abdullah al-Naim, for example, is one attempt at reconceptualizing Sharia and trying to put it in a more progressive light. But at some point, we may have to simply say that something is not the proper vehicle, but not without first exploring where we can find mutual grounds.
I hate to say that we're running out of, we're 10 minutes overdue, but if anyone has a final comment, we'll be happy to hear to wrap up this session this morning. Casey, anything?
I can attempt to make a final comment. I really liked, I think my point was put in 2 words by Dina, whose culture? And so that's the part that I really liked, that of course education is so important, but we need to be able to express what we actually think is right. And in a lot of places in the world, unfortunately, women, no matter what they believe, they don't have the choice. They have to follow, because whether it's a sense of belonging or society, along with what is happening. And so going back to just the opening that we did to the conference so far, we need to make sure that men understand that implicating women in economic decisions, in security decisions, in the country as a whole, in laws, really does benefit them, because it helps get them out of these traps that they're in and can possibly change things for the better. So that's definitely something that I think needs to be pushed for, whether it's legally, internationally, nationally, or grassroots level.
Thank you.
That was my attempt anyway.
It's a good wrap-up, actually.
Anything?
Just quickly, very quickly, just to say,
sentences.
yeah, when we talk about women and men, sometimes we put really women in a very vulnerable, weak position, as that they have no agency, they cannot be political decision makers unless you have this American type of quotas when they had for Afghanistan and Iraq. They destroyed the country then they say, oh, we are rebuilding it. You know, we have women 30% quota for the first time in the history of these savages. They are in parliament now, everything is going to be fine. What they chose, sorry, I'm really very much against this rhetorics, they put women with veil. I mean, in the history, I mean, I've never seen women in burqa in Iraq, to be honest with you, I've never